Hello, and welcome to the Chicago Office of Inspector General's live Q&A session. So just hours ago, we released our most recent report, including findings, recommendations, and departmental response to our inquiry into the Chicago Police Department's enforcement of their Rule 14 against false reports. We are so delighted that you've joined us today. We invite you to say hello and to ask questions in the comments. And of course, if you're watching after the fact, we are so glad that you've joined us as well. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to your Inspector General for the City of Chicago, Deborah Witzburg. Deborah, welcome and good to see you.
Hello, thank you.
Well, this is wonderful. I just want to say that for members of the media, please know that we're so grateful for all that you do to really amplify the work and the important issues that we write about and do audits and study. And so please know that this is a yes and. We're glad that you're here. And also, we invite you to contact us with any additional questions, interviews, and things like that. So I'm Deanna Schaas. I'm the Director of Outreach and Communications for the Office of Inspector General. And again, we're here today for this Q&A with your Inspector General, Deborah Witzburg. So, Deborah, we are going to dive right in. Again, just hours ago, we released our most recent report, and it's about the police departments. It's about the enforcement, or I guess as the report said, under enforcement of Rule 14. So why don't we start with what is Rule 14 and why is it so critical to underlie trust between community and Chicago Police Department sworn members?
Yeah, thank you. Rule 14 is one of the rules of conduct of the Chicago Police Department, and it prohibits members from making false reports, written or oral. And so what that means is that is the rule that police department members break when they tell a lie or when they make a material omission, when they fail to tell the whole truth. It's a critical rule of conduct for a couple of reasons. Trustworthiness and credibility are foundational to the fair administration of criminal justice. And so police department members, in order to do their jobs as law enforcement officers, must be truthful and credible, both so that they earn the trust of people in the communities in which they serve, and so that they can effectively serve CPD's law enforcement functions. We may talk about this in more detail, but if a police officer has been found to have lied, they can't do some things that are really critical to effective law enforcement. They can't testify in court. They can't serve as the affiant on a search warrant. They can't serve on a law enforcement task force. It renders them unable to carry out the core law enforcement duties of the police department. And so it's those two things. It's those two reasons that this is so important, because we cannot have trust without truthfulness, and we cannot keep people safe from crimes we can't prosecute.
Sure. Now, Deborah, there's a lot of things that the Office of Inspector General sends out which relate to the consent decree. Is this something that falls under that, or can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. So the Chicago Police Department and other components of the city are currently operating under a federal consent decree entered in the lawsuit Illinois versus Chicago. And the consent decree is a 799 paragraph court order mandating a lengthy series of reforms to Chicago's policing and police accountability systems. One of those requirements in the consent decree is that the Office of Inspector General's Public Safety Section conduct an inquiry into the enforcement of Rule 14. And so that is what we have done here. This report is responsive to that mandate. And I think it's important to note that of all of the things coming under OIG's jurisdiction, there are only very, very few topics which are specifically identified for mandatory study in the consent decree. This is one of those topics, and I think that's a really critical recognition of how important an issue this is.
And I know there's a number of case studies in the report, and Patrick Smith is asking what time period did our study cover, and how much? I believe this is a very current, real issue right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Our report does does two things. It sort of looks at historical evolution of Rule 14 cases, as well as some very recently closed disciplinary investigations, very recently ongoing matters. And so, important to note, I think, that while the mandate to study the enforcement of Rule 14 derives from the consent decree, the rule was in place long before the consent decree was entered, long before 2019. And so we are looking at the sort of history of the rule. And the historical tale is really long. One of the things we get at in the report is the fact that there are over 100 people actively serving in the police department or having recently served who violated Rule 14, were found to have lied and continued recently to serve as members of the Chicago Police Department. This is all of which is to say this is current affairs, not history.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So the press headline was the under enforcement of Rule 14. What were the objectives of the inquiry? And I know you've touched on that some, but what were the objectives and what did you find?
So we looked at all of the entities comprising Chicago's police accountability system. And the purpose of the inquiry was to determine whether those entities taken together as a system are effectively doing three things with respect to Rule 14 violations, whether we are pursuing, punishing, and publishing violations of Rule 14. That is to say, are we effectively investigating whether police department members have broken this rule? Are we pursuing this allegation? Are we punishing people appropriately when they are found to have violated the rule? All of the involved entities here, the police department's Bureau of Internal Affairs, COPA, or the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, and the Police Board, have all made admirable and important statements about their views, their respective institutional views, that people who have violated Rule 14 are not qualified to serve as police officers, as members of the police department. So we look at whether that is sort of, whether we're walking the walk on that, and whether people who have violated this rule, people who have lied, are in fact being separated from the police department. So that's the punishment piece. The question of publishing, of sharing this information, we talked a little bit about the fact that the government, the prosecuting authority in a criminal prosecution, is obligated to disclose certain information to criminal defendants, and the government has disclosure obligations in civil litigation as well, which means that the constitutional and legal rights of criminal defendants and litigants require our ability to identify and disclose when a CPD member has been found to have lied, has been found to have violated Rule 14. And what we found there was that there are inadequate controls in place to ensure that we are consistently sharing that information, even when legally required to do so.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like, I feel like in layman's terms, basically, if someone lies, you can't trust them then to testify in court. And so therefore, the recommendation is that they should be, I know the word is separated, but basically that they should be fired.
Yes.
So those recommendations were given to the agency. I guess it's COPA, the BIA, the police board. What was the response? And actually, this is important for people to understand. When the Office of Inspector General publishes a report, so the report itself, there's the investigation and the inquiry, but it goes to the departments in question for them to respond before it actually gets published, which it's now actually published on our board as of today. But can you talk about what the response was?
Yeah, well, I will first say we made a series of recommendations to the involved entities here. Again, to get at this full spectrum of questions, are we pursuing, punishing, and publishing Rule 14 violations appropriately? The first of those recommendations is exactly the one that you talked about, and it is that whenever a member is found to have lied, the city should pursue their firing. Those people should not continue to serve as members of the Chicago Police Department. And so that is the first and the sort of top line recommendation. We make a series of other recommendations as well to improve the mechanisms by which the investigating agencies are considering potential Rule 14 violations, the way those analyses are documented in investigative files, the way accurate records are kept for members who have been found to have violated the rule. One of the I think really concerning pieces of information we uncovered, we collected investigative files of cases in which Rule 14 allegations were investigated. And we identified certain disciplinary investigations where there had been Rule 14 allegations, and no one could find the investigative files. And so, there are incomplete, inadequate records associated with these violations, which go to the very core of people's ability to continue to serve as police officers.
Mhm. Well, what is the process? So if an officer is found, or I don't know, what is, I'm using my language, but please, let's all know that it's the Inspector General's language that we want to focus on. So the idea of, if someone is suspected or found to have a Rule 14 violation, what happens next? Like, what is the process right now, and what should it be?
Yeah. The procedural life
Mhm.
cycle of a police misconduct investigation in Chicago is a very, very complicated one. At a very high level, one of the investigating agencies, usually the Bureau of Internal Affairs or COPA, will conduct an investigation into allegations of misconduct, and they will reach investigative findings most of the time. That is, they will determine whether to sustain those allegations, whether the evidence shows by a preponderance, more likely than not, that a violation, that the misconduct has occurred. If BIA or COPA finds that a CPD member has committed misconduct, has lied in the case of Rule 14, then they recommend a disciplinary penalty. They recommend a punishment for that violation. And that recommendation goes to the superintendent, who, as the employer, makes a decision about whether they agree with the investigative finding and whether to pursue the recommended discipline. From there, the police department issues a disciplinary penalty upon a sustained finding.
Mhm.
And then, depending on what that penalty is and depending on the rank of the accused member, they may have a variety of options to challenge or to appeal that determination.
Mhm. And I think you already sort of covered this a little bit, but Patrick talks about the idea of the public trust and the department. So, you know, what does that do to, you've touched on a little bit, but talk a little bit more. I'm thinking, like, for everyday people who obviously the Inspector General's office is the watchdog to give voice to that. What does it do to public trust, and why is it so important?
I think there's a really human, really common sense driven response here, which is that we cannot ask people to trust a police department that lets its members get away with lying.
Mhm.
We can't conduct effective law enforcement with people whose credibility we can't ensure. Um, because police officers who can't testify in court might as well not
Mhm.
arrest people. We can't keep people safe from crimes we can't prosecute. And I think that there is a great deal of discussion, and it is on the hearts and minds of so many Chicagoans, how critically important it is to improve the relationship between our police department and our communities. Both because, and that's for two reasons. It's because members of Chicago's communities are entitled to a police department they trust. It's also because that's how we keep people safe. I was a Cook County prosecutor before I did this work.
Mhm.
It was my experience that we did not effectively fight crime because a police officer happened to be standing on a street corner to see something bad happen. We
Sure.
successfully prosecuted crimes because somebody trusted a police officer enough to tell them what happened. And I think this goes to that foundational issue of trust. And as I say, we cannot ask people to trust a police department that lets its members get away with lying.
Mhm. The other thing with that, just even for sworn members of the police department, and as you mentioned, there's over 100 officers right now who have Rule 14 violations that are still on the force, but that actually isn't helpful to the 14,000 officers or sworn members that are representing the city. I mean, it seems like in that also just internally, and when we talk about trust with the police department, that's really important because so many police officers are doing such great and important work.
That is absolutely right and critically important. And I should say, one of the things that's included in our report are some statements from the agencies involved, including the police department, about exactly this, about the fact that a police officer who lies reflects poorly and damages the credibility on everybody else wearing the uniform.
Yeah.
It does the good and honorable people who do the work of the Chicago Police Department every day a tremendous disservice and dishonor.
Yeah. Mhm. Which also goes into the issue of police reform. I love, you have a great quote on this, how police reform and good police are part of the same equation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that is the observation that, I think there's a lot of risk in the ongoing public policy conversation about police reform in Chicago. There's a risk that we fall into the notion that there's a dichotomy here, that we can
Mhm. Yeah.
either pursue public safety reform or we can pursue effective law enforcement. And the fact of the matter is that police reform, public safety reform is not an alternative to public safety. It's a prerequisite to it. The only way we can keep people safe is by reforming the way we police. And this, I think, goes precisely to that issue. We cannot conduct effective law enforcement unless we reform this piece of the accountability system.
So is there anything else from the report? Like what's important? I'm thinking, I always took the voice of the everyday citizen, because we know we're so grateful for media and are available for any other questions or deeper dive into this. But for, everyday citizens or people that are watching, what's the biggest takeaways that you would say?
I think it's really important to note here that the agencies involved, our partners on the police accountability and reform landscape in Chicago, have committed to what I think are the right views of the importance of Rule 14, of how critically, foundationally important credibility and trustworthiness are. However, we are not seeing the enforcement of Rule 14 play out in a way that lives up to those policy commitments. And that's what leads us to the bottom line conclusion here, which is that Rule 14 is under-enforced. And so I appreciate the policy commitments of these agencies, and they are to be commended for taking what I think is the right view of the importance of the enforcement of this rule. We got to walk the walk on how we do it.
And did you look at why? So the policies are in place. It says this is supposed to happen. Is there something that's getting in, or what is it, do you think, that's getting in the way of the rule being enforced?
We look at a couple of things in this report. There are gaps in policies and procedures, which I think are contributing to the under-enforcement. We go through that in some detail. Those things have to do with the policies in place to guide BIA and COPA investigators, the way violations and analyses are reported, et cetera. So I think there are some policy and procedure gaps. I also think that there are case-by-case decisions which are made not in line with the high-level priority public policy commitments. So one of the things we do in this report is we include case studies where we describe individual situations, a number of different examples of circumstances. We look at CPD members who were found to have violated Rule 14, but they weren't separated. We look at cases where CPD members were found to have lied, but Rule 14 violations were not pursued. We look at cases where the police department agreed to expunge Rule 14 violations from their members' histories. They found that a member had violated Rule 14 and agreed to remove that from the disciplinary history. And so I think, the answer there is that there are policy and process gaps. And then there is just the need to deal with individual cases in a way that meets our larger commitments on the policy issue.
And when we talk about those false reports, it can be oral or written. So it may be literally an incident report where something is not truthful, or if someone is I guess, relaying that, or would that be from testifying, or would be giving an oral summary of?
Could be any one of those things. Rule 14 can be violated, as you say, in a written statement or in an oral statement. It can be violated in the ordinary conduct of police work. It can be, people can violate Rule 14 in the context of a disciplinary investigation. That's not all that unusual, where somebody will be under investigation for something else entirely and lie in the course of that investigation. That's a Rule 14 violation. We mentioned this a little bit at the beginning. Material omissions are violations of Rule 14 if people fail to tell the whole truth. People can violate Rule 14 in their off-duty conduct. A huge range of lies constitute violations of this rule. And the rule is that broad, it is that encompassing, precisely because the credibility and truthfulness and trustworthiness of a member of the police department is foundational and absolutely indispensable to their ability to function effectively.
And so within those recommendations, as you've just defined all the different ways that Rule 14 might apply, it sounds like you're encouraging those oversight agencies to actually use that broad definition of Rule 14 to invoke it in these different instances, and then of course enforce and enforce whatever the repercussions are for that.
Absolutely. That's sort of the pursue part of this three-part challenge with enforcement of the rule, that Rule 14 violations should be pursued by the investigative agency when they are suggested by the evidence. And there's a high evidentiary standard to establish a violation of Rule 14. Sure. A false statement must be material and willful, and so there's that standard must be met. The investigating agencies should be pursuing those violations wherever they might arise.
Okay. Well, I think, Deborah, this has been absolutely wonderful. If there's any, again, if you're watching live and every other final questions, please chime in. You can read the full report at igchicago.org. You can read it and download it. Of course, you can also contact media relations at communications at igchicago.org, or you can actually just call us as well. Any closing comments that you have for us? Is there anything you'd like just people to know or to do, as we all look for, again, our goal is to make city government better or to hold city actors accountable if they break the rules. And that's an everyone eyes open process. So any other final words that you have for our viewers and everyone watching after the fact as well?
No, just to say that, we really appreciate the partnership of the other reform and accountability agencies on the landscape here, and very much look forward to the more effective enforcement of this rule. That's how we get a police department that Chicagoans deserve, in uniform and out. That's how we protect the honor of the good work being done.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Inspector General Witzburg, and thank you everyone who is watching live. Fantastic, and we look forward to having more of these Q&As to share the work of the Inspector General's office. So, thank you, Deborah. Thank you, everyone watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.